This example is from MGF 1107, section 11.1, that deals with percents. In this problem, we have two brands of copier, and we know that brand X copier advertises that its copiers run 20% longer between service calls than its competitor. We don't know the name of the competitor though. It says if brand X copiers run 60,100 copies between service calls, how many copies would the competitor run? Well, we don't know the number of copies between service calls for the competitor, so that's an unknown, so we could let that be a variable. But we do know, at least how it's advertised, that brand X advertises that its copiers run 20% longer than the competitor. So why don't we assign a variable in this problem? Why don't we let y be the number of copies between service calls for the competitor. We don't know that. That is going to be the answer to the question. Now we do know brand X, though, is 20% longer than that, though. And that brand X is 60,100 copies between service calls. So to write an equation here, we have to figure out what is equal to 60,100 copies. And we know that's the brand X number of copies between service calls. And we know that amount is what the competitor is plus 20% more than the competitor. So we know the competitor's number of copies between service calls is y. So to write an equation, we would take y, which is the number of copies from the competitor between service calls, and as the problem states, we add 20% more than y to it in order to get up to x's. So we take y, which is the number of copies for the competitor, plus, since it's longer, we're going to add 20% as a decimal is 0.2 or 2/10 of y. So again, what this says is the competitor number of copies between service calls plus 20% more of the competitor would be equal to brand X. And that's exactly what that sentence states. Now we have to solve this linear equation by adding like terms. So this coefficient is 1. So we have 1 y plus 2/10 of a y. So that's 1.2 times the competitor is equal to brand X's number of copies between service calls. Then to isolate y, we have to divide by 1.2, since the 1.2 right now is being multiplied by the y. In order to make it a 1y, we have to divide by the coefficient of 1.2. 1.2's would divide out, and we get y is equal to, take your calculator, 60,100 divided by 1.2. Again, it should be a smaller amount than 60,100. And it is. What I get is 50,083 copies. And the decimal part is 0.3333. So that would round down to 83 copies, not round up to 84 copies, since it's 0.3. So that is the number of copies between service calls for brand Y. So in other words, if you buy brand Y, you're going to have to call service more often because there's only 50,000 roughly copies between service calls. But if you buy brand X copiers, you get an extra roughly 10,000 copies before you have to call for service. So let's see if that is one of the options, and it is one of the options. It's B. One way you could check this, again, we did round that 50,083 slightly, so this is not going to check perfectly. But one way you could check is you could take y's number of copies, 50,083, and add 20% of that amount and see if you really do get brand X's number of copies. And again, it won't be perfect because that 83 is a slightly rounded number, but when we have the number of copies, we did have to round it to a whole number because you can't have part of a copy. So 50,083 times 0.2 gives you roughly 10,016 or 17. And then you add that to 50,083 and you get 60,099.6. So again, this value right here will give you 10,016.6. So all we're doing here is checking to see if we have a reasonable answer. And if you add those, you get 60,099.6. And if you round to the nearest copy, that 60,100. Check, because that's the number of copies between service calls for brand X.